Hi, I'm Leanpub from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Bruno Rodrigues. Based in Luxembourg, Bruno is an economist and statistician who works with the Luxembourg Ministry of Higher Education and Research. You can follow him on Twitter at brodriguesco, and that's Rodrigues with an S, on Mastodon at fostodon.org/@brodriguesco, and check out his website at brodrigues.co. Bruno is the author of the Leanpub book, Building Reproducible Analytical Pipelines with R. In the book, Bruno shows readers how to build reproducible analytical pipelines to output consistent, high-quality data products using R, GitHub, and Docker. In this interview, we're going to talk about Bruno's background and career, professional interests, his book, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his experience as a blogger and self-published author. So thank you very much, Bruno, for being on the Leanpub Front Matter podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up, how you found your way into getting a PhD in economics and into the job you have and into writing books.
Okay, so I was really looking forward to that question, actually, because it's the opportunity for me to tell a story that I think will resonate with a lot of people like me. So it all started in 1980 when my father decided to move to Luxembourg. So my parents are Portuguese, and they decided to move to Luxembourg. And Luxembourg is this very tiny central northern European country, sandwiched between France and Germany and Belgium. And 14%, actually almost 15% of the population is Portuguese still today. So it's the biggest minority, let's say. And I'm saying this because it's really important because I was born here. I grew up here in Luxembourg, which is this country, tiny country with 3 official languages: French, Luxembourgese, and German. Portuguese obviously is not one, even though you can hear it on the streets a lot. And it was quite interesting because so my household was Portuguese. We talked Portuguese, we ate Portuguese, we watched Portuguese TV. And then whenever I stepped out the door, I was confronted to a very different world, even though that's the world I was born in. And it was quite important because Luxembourg is very well known for its financial place, for its financial sector. A lot of banks, lots of insurances, lots of these kind of companies that do all matters of fiscal optimization and things like that. And I was born in a, let's say, quite modest home. So my parents just told me I had to study. That's that's always what they told me. You have to study, you have to study. You cannot end up like us, minimum wage workers and, having to work all your life, basically. You have to study because that's the ticket to have a comfortable life. And so I studied. I just studied, but I didn't really have in my network, let's say, any people that also studied or people that went to university or things like that. And most Portuguese people in Luxembourg, the overwhelming majority, are also from the same kind of very humble origins, let's say. These are all people that basically left Portugal right after the revolution, because until the 70s, Portugal was a dictatorship. And once this was over, well, people went abroad for better lives and better opportunities. And so because I didn't really know, I knew I had to study, but I didn't really know what. I decided, well, Luxembourg has a lot of banks, has a huge financial, sector. So I'll study economics, whatever. I like math. So I actually wanted to study physics, but I thought, I will never find a job here in Luxembourg studying physics. So I'll go for economics, whatever that is, banks, economy, whatever. I just study that. And so I started studying that really just because Luxembourg was this, country with a lot of banks. And it's quite, maybe not a very valid reason, but at the time, if you don't really have that network around you to kind of guide you, well, you have to do some decision. And so I studied economics. And it turns out that when I was studying economics, the things that I liked most were statistics, econometrics, and data mining. We had a course on data mining that I found fascinating, which basically could have, nowadays you could name that course like artificial intelligence, because it basically was that. It was the very basic techniques from artificial intelligence, but that's like the introduction to it was like k-means and all these kind of methods. that form the basis of artificial intelligence. I found this fascinating, and so I went more towards quantitative methods, and so I studied econometrics, I studied statistics, and then another very important event that seems quite random, but was that my parents bought me a laptop for university that came with Windows Vista. And I had a lot of problems with Windows Vista. And I knew a friend, an internet friend, we chatted like on a video game forum. And he told me, hey, you should try this thing called Linux. I said, well, okay, why not? Let's install Ubuntu. He advised me I use Ubuntu, a very simple Linux distribution. So I installed that. And I did that around 2008. And I've been using that since, well, not Ubuntu anymore, but Linux since then, basically. And this was important because it made me discover the world of software, and specifically free software and open source. And I became fascinated with the concept of writing codes and sharing it with everybody, and then having this license where if people take your code and they continue modifying your code, then they have to reshare it as well with the world. I found this fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And I asked my professor at the time, my econometrics professor, hey, what's like the programming language or a free software programming language or tool that is used for econometrics? And at the time, he told me, and you have, so I should say that I studied in France. So we talked in French, obviously. And he told me, well, there's this software called R. He said, R. And I said, okay, R. So I went to Google that day and I started Googling it, R. And air in French means the air around us the air that is around us. So I was looking for air, AIR, and I didn't find anything. I found data sets on air quality and things like that. And so I went back to him and I asked him, sorry, I didn't get it. Is it air? And he said, yes, air. And I started, but air, how do you spell it? AIR. And then he told me, no, the letter R, because in French, the letter R is R. Mm-hmm. And so he was talking about the R programming language that I use still today. And the only reason I started using it was because it was an open source and free software language for econometrics. And it was the only one. And even today, it's kind of the only one specifically where you can do specifically econometrics, kind of the only one that is open source. I mean, you could do some econometrics with Python, but it's really not as developed as R. And so that's where it all started. I installed it. I started trying some stuff, programming. I found programming fascinating. I had a programming course in high school that I absolutely hated. I never thought I would work with computers. Turns out that once you have the kind of problems that you like to solve, then it becomes interesting. So I started programming, and I said, okay, I need to, this needs to become my job. I love it. I love econometrics. I love statistics. I love programming. All these kind of things. I just need to work in this. And so again, being a bit naive still and not really having the knowledge and the network around me, I thought I'm going to go into research. I'm going to become a researcher, and I'll be a successful professor in university. Well, I learned very quickly when I started my PhD program that finding a position, an academic position, is quite difficult. And I realized quickly that, that wasn't, in the end, wasn't for me. But I still loved programming. I still loved, statistics. And that was around the time, 2010-ish, that was around the time where people started talking more and more about data science. So I thought, okay, I'll finish my PhD. I started it. I'm going to finish it. It was a horrible experience, but that I would not, that I would not, how would you say that in English? I would still do it, even if I could go back in time. I would still do it because it opened a lot of doors, but it was a horrible experience, I must say. But I learned quite a lot, and then I just went into data science. I worked some years into data science in a consulting company. Which was quite interesting because it made me realize what kind of the business world was, which I didn't know anything about because I studied economics. I was then doing a PhD in a university. My parents and my network we don't know anyone that was kind of working in business or whatever. But, so it was, for me, it was a huge discovery again. So I learned a lot there as well. And then I went work for the public sector, in part because I was also looking for a better work-life balance with my children and my family. So I wanted something where I knew that, you know, if I had to leave the office at 4, I could leave at 4, and that there was no urgent meeting for some client or whatever that we had to stay at the office until whatever. This was really fine until I had children, but then yeah, I just had to stop with that. And that's kind of where I am today. I work now for the public sector, so as you said, in the Ministry of Higher Education and Research, and all this path, let's say, yeah, it's really made me learn a lot of things, and now I think I am where I really need to be.
Thanks very much for sharing that really great story. There's actually a lot to talk about there. That's interesting. I personally did not know about how many Portuguese people there were in Luxembourg.
It's you.
Yeah, it sort of makes sense the way you explained it, but I wasn't aware of that history. One thing that story reminded me of was my dad grew up in the Canadian province of Saskatchewan, where I grew up. His parents were immigrants, German-speaking immigrants from Ukraine, and German was actually the second most spoken language in this Canadian province for a long time. But he had this experience where, like, he was, you know, in sort of parallel way to the way you were describing, where, like, you know, like my grandparents didn't know anything about Canada, right? And so when my dad was applying for his first government job, there was a question on the application that said, "Are you bilingual?" And of course, my dad, his first language was German. But his second language was English, and he was fluent in English, and he knew what the English meaning of the word bilingual was, which was I speak 2 languages.
Right.
That's not what bilingual means in Canada. In Canada, bilingual means you speak English and French.
Oh, right.
All other languages are excluded from the linguistic universe in official Canada.
Oh, wow. That's quite interesting.
Yeah, for interesting historical reasons. So he goes to the interview, and it was sort of, you know, they're like, "Oh, so you're bilingual," and they thought that meant he could speak French.
Oh man!
And he said, "No, it means I can speak German." And they were like, there was this kind of like back and forth where it's kind of like embarrassing. I mean, he didn't go into details, but they're both sides are kind of embarrassed actually because. But anyway, no, it is so interesting how, like, those, you can be in a society and, like, be living a full life, but, like, actually be kind of outside of it.
Oh yeah.
At the same time, and it sounds like that a lot of your experience was kind of like that.
Yeah, it was. So I actually, for a very long time, did not speak Luxembourgish, like, at all. I picked up French very quickly because it's close to Portuguese, but Luxembourgish and German. So Luxembourgish is, linguistically speaking, Luxembourg is like a German dialect, but it's the national language in Luxembourg. And for a very long time, I didn't speak that. So I really just picked that up, like, I don't know, when I was maybe 10 or 11, which is really late. I kind of understood when teachers would talk to me, but speaking it was difficult. And even today, I still have a Portuguese accent when I speak Luxembourgish, even though now I have the nationality, like I'm a full Luxembourgish citizen. But even, like, it's not my native language, and sometimes speaking with people, I have to, like, translate in real time because it's still not natural. My wife is French, so we speak French at home. So I just speak Luxembourgish at work, and it's not the language I'm most comfortable with. I actually would even say that I now speak English better probably than Luxembourgish. At least it's not so, how would you say, it's not so much work. It comes a bit more naturally.
One thing that's kind of perhaps sort of surprisingly come up on the podcast many times in the past is different educational systems, particularly at the university level. And I don't know if I've ever spoken to anyone who went to the University of Strasbourg. You went to university in France.
Right.
But I'd also like to ask you about university in Luxembourg and if they're the same. I mean, so for example, like in North America, a typical undergraduate university degree, you take a kind of general year in your first year, and then you choose a major. And then most of your courses are in the major for the rest of your undergraduate, but you still have what are called electives in other subjects. In the UK, it can be very different, where it's just like one subject, that's all you study, when you're there. What was it like for you in Strasbourg, and what's it like in Luxembourg if it's different?
Well, it really depends on the university. There are some universities, I guess, that kind of, let's say, mimic or are closer to the US system. But most of, at least in my experience, and when I talk to people, to other students, etc., in most of the time, what you have is that you, for example, if you study economics, you will do economics, like you will have macro, micro, whatever, yeah, and you'll just have that. And maybe the last year of your undergrad, so the bachelor's, we call it. So you have a bachelor's, master's, and then the PhD. So the third year, which is the last year of your bachelor's, there it can be that you will choose some kind of specialized courses. For example, in my case, it was quantitative economics, but there were other people that were then doing more law kind of things. I have a friend that did actuarial sciences, so more for insurance and things like that. And that was in the third year. And then, of course, the master's degree, then it's more specialized once again. But the system that you have 3 years of a bachelor, 2 years of a master, and then 3 years of a PhD, 3 years PhD in theory, because in practice it's a lot longer. That's kind of now regulated Europe-wide through the Bologna process. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It's to make it easier to travel, basically, because in Europe you have the free, so people can travel freely. So I could literally go to Bulgaria tomorrow and nobody would ask a question because I'm an EU citizen. But the problem was that before the Bologna process, your courses, your degree, you have a PhD or whatever in economics in France, that doesn't mean that you are qualified to work in Bulgaria or that it's the same, right? So now through the Bologna process, this is kind of standardized. So if I go to another European country, my title will be recognized automatically, basically.
You're reminding me of something. And I'm curious because I'm sort of out of date now, but obviously, but was it the case at a time in France that like to become a professor in France, you just like applied to become a professor, and then they kind of told you where you were going if you got through?
Okay. I didn't know that system at the time because this was already before my time, I'd say. But from what I remember from the discussions at the time, what happened is that you did a degree. At the time, it was 4 years, not 5, for a master's. So they call it a maîtrise. So you did your maîtrise that was 4 years. And the last year, if I'm not mistaken, this is where you could choose between writing like a master's thesis that was heavy research. So your last year was really focused on teaching you research, or having an internship, a 6-month internship, and then just going for a job. And so if you went for I think they called it the DEA, the DEA degree, that was the last year of this maîtrise. If you went for that, then you could do a PhD, etc. And then once you wanted to become a professor, and this I don't think it changed too much, you would apply. They would, of course, look at your curriculum, etc. And then you had to do interviews basically all over France or wherever you were invited. And this kind didn't really change. And then after the interviews, you may or may not get a position. What I remember from my discussions at the time with my professors is that 30, 40 years ago, it was very easy to get a position because there were not a lot of people with PhD degrees that wanted to go to be professors. Nowadays, it's incredibly difficult, and so yeah, you really have to be lucky, but also really, really good. You have to be really at the top 1% minds, let's say, to get the job in the academic sector, and which I'm obviously not. So I thought, okay, you know what, I'm going to do something else where I know I can bring value, but yeah, unfortunately, I cannot compete with some of the minds that were applying. So I didn't even try to apply.
I'm looking forward to asking you about your PhD in a moment. But before we do that, you mentioned, coming from a background where, people weren't really familiar with university and studying and things like they knew that it existed, of course,
right,
important, and it was a way into sort of a comfortable life, as you said. I had friends who were similar, kind of like this. They go to university and they're like, oh my God, like I know what school is, but what's this?
Right.
What was that? Can you just talk a little bit about what that experience was like for you? Did you have friends who you could talk to? Were you in like a dormitory or something like that? Because
Yeah.
it's funny for when you're sort of get older and those things are long in your past. You can they're the kinds of things that are easy to take for granted, but like for anyone listening who's maybe 17 or 18 and facing this, like that's
Right.
like hard. Um,
Right.
and so if you could maybe share a little bit about, if you can recall,
Yeah.
a little bit about how you made it through the first little while.
So I was quite lucky because I rented a small apartment with a friend, a high school friend, that also went to study in Strasbourg, and he had kind of the same story as me, but he's not Portuguese, he's Chinese, but it's really kind of exactly the same. They like his parents left China, because they were looking for better opportunities, and exactly basically the same story, just replaced Portugal with China basically. And so he was kind of in the same spot as me. So we had each other, we could talk to each other, we helped each other, so that was great. And thankfully, my older brother that didn't go to uni, he didn't go to university, but he had a high school friend that went to university and that was finishing his studies when I arrived in Strasbourg. And he was also in Strasbourg. Strasbourg is a quite popular destination for people from Luxembourg, actually, because it's not too far away. So we can go there by train, and you speak French, so you can very easily integrate into Strasbourg, let's say. And so he was finishing, like he was in his last year, I think, when I started. And so he really showed me a lot of he showed me around in the city where I should go, where I should ask for, for papers, for whatever. In France, there's this notion, I don't know if this exists anywhere else, but I guess it might. There's this notion of universitary restaurants. So these are restaurants that are open all day, but just for students. And you can go there and get a meal for like €2. At the time, it was €2. So nowadays, maybe a bit more, but it's very, very cheap and relatively high quality. And so it showed me, because I didn't know that this kind of thing existed, and no one tells you at university. You just think that there's the canteen of the faculty itself, but there are literally restaurants in the city that are not very, if you pass by them, you don't even notice that they're restaurants, but you can go there as a student and get this cheap meal. So he showed me things like that. So thankfully, I had people around me that were more experienced, but only once I went there. And where I was lucky as well was I really quickly adapted to how things are taught in university. So I really quickly understood that you had to work by yourself, which was not a problem for me, thankfully. And actually, I really enjoyed the fact that teachers, at least in France, but I guess it's everywhere the same, they don't care about you. So in a sense, this may seem a bit weird to like that, but it's the fact that they don't tell you how you should work. They just tell you, okay, you have to do this, you have to do that, and then you just do it. And I found this really, really nice, because I enjoyed high school because of my friends, let's say, but I didn't like how school works. Like, you have to sit there for so many hours, and you have to do even basic stupid things that don't make any sense, but you have to do it because it's in the program. In university, if I didn't care about the course, I just never went, and that it was on me. It was my responsibility, right? And I really enjoyed that. And so I was lucky in that aspect, that I adapted really quickly to how things worked at university. And then, because I also enjoyed what I was learning, I also went then to the professors, at their office, knocked on their doors and asked them questions. Look, I don't understand this thing. Can you explain? And they love this. And I also I'm very lucky right now that I also teach a course at the University of Luxembourg in the winter semester on reproducible pipelines. And I love it. I just love it when students come to me with questions, because it means they're paying attention. It means they're interested. And, it's a bit for my ego as well. So, and I think that's why teachers also liked it and liked me as well. And they, they explained stuff to me, and it really went well in that aspect afterwards. But I was lucky. I had a good friend, and he's still my friend, by the way. We've known each other for like 18 years now. And I had some experienced people, thankfully, that were there already, that were not directly my friends, but they were my older brother's friends. So yeah, that was, without them, it would have been, probably more difficult.
Yeah, that's actually funny. That's a very sort of specifically go talk to your professors is this sort of recommendation that I give when I get the chance to people. And like, it's sort of funny, like the way you describe, like, you're on your own at university, and like that was exactly one thing I realized right away and loved. Like, it was exactly what I wanted.
Right.
And in one of the ways I also try and explain like what the difference between university and say school is that like it reminds me of, so I in a former life I was an investment banker, and someone once explained to me, like, it's not a job. They've given you a desk and resources.
Yeah, right.
Now you've got this global company at your fingertips to kind of do things with. But that's the way you should think of it. Not and universities like that. Like that professor in front of you. I mean, some professors suck, and don't forget that. And some guides lead you astray. But that's all part of using your head. It's like if you joined a bad martial arts school, it's not your fault. You couldn't know, but you should figure it out. You've got a bad teacher after a while. Same thing with the university. And like, you've just got these incredible resources at your disposal if you have the good fortune to have the time to go. And that professor is not a teacher. That professor is a researcher who is giving you their time.
Right.
Is the way to look at it. And as you say, like, they want to talk. It sounds sort of all hands off. Not at all. It's just it's up to you. It's up to you to initiate. And professors love it when you ask questions. But also that story, the great story you told about your older brother's friend being able to guide you.
Right.
I can't, for anyone who's like starting out in anything, like, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to like try and find a guide.
Right.
Someone, because even things like, and by the way, I suspect that the sort of like making sure there's good, cheap food for students is uniquely French.
Perhaps, I don't know.
It's definitely not English that much, but anyway, it's very important. It's very important to find a guide to, like, because those little details can actually make a big difference in your life.
Oh yeah,
and they can really make you feel like you fit in ways. But again, the sort of the main key is ask questions,
right?
Which is something you write about as well. Which is like, ask questions. Don't be afraid. The kind of person who looks down on you for asking questions, then you get your answer, right? One way or the other from them. And that can be a really important lesson to learn. So you mentioned your PhD wasn't the best of times. I forget the old joke that's like, every family is, what was it, Tolstoy? Every family is unhappy in its own way, thing like that. And PhDs are like that. Not all, but most. So I was wondering, actually, if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about that, because you made it through. Congratulations on all that. It's a big deal. But in what way did yours, without naming names, in what ways did yours suck?
Well, I think it was a combination of several things. The first thing was that, and this is, I guess it's nobody's fault. It's just how the system is. So I mentioned the old system where before you had like this maîtrise of 4 years. And then on the last year, you could choose, okay, I want to do research. So they spent a year teaching you how to do research. Nowadays, with the new system, so we have the advantage that I can travel anywhere, and I'm a doctor everywhere in Europe. Basically, my PhD is recognized. But this also meant that this last year or this maîtrise was axed in favor of the master's degree. And the master's degree does not really have this last year where you only do research. Basically, what happens is that during your last semester, which would be the fourth semester of your master's, the last semester, you either do an internship or you write a master's thesis. So you only have one semester that's like 4 months, basically 4 or 5 months, to finally do some research, but you just don't know how to do it. So you have to, in 4 months, basically learn how to read a paper, how to write a paper, how to write a literature review, how to code as well, because the things you're coding are very different from before, because before I was just using stuff that was already existing, but now I have to do research. I have to come up with new things. I have to come up with new knowledge. And that's really difficult, much more difficult than what I anticipated. And I wasn't really prepared for it. And I think it's a bit because of that change in the system. So I never really learned how to do research. So what happens is that you have to do research or learn how to do research during your PhD as you go along. And that might not be such a problem if they didn't tell you, well, if you finish your first year and you don't already have like a good working paper, then it's really going to be difficult because that puts so much pressure on you. And I did not have a working paper at the end of my first year. I did not even have a working paper at the end of my second year. Only like at the end of my third year did I have like two kind of working papers. But so I knew from the start, okay, this is going to be tough. Like I will probably not going to be a researcher. And once I realized this, then it went better, I must say. Once I accepted that, okay, I'm going to do my PhD, I'm going to work on it, I'm going to do hopefully the best work I can. But, forget about being a researcher, let's go to the private sector and let's do other stuff. Once I realized this, it went better, I must say. But the first 3 years were a bit difficult because I realized that I did not have the knowledge to be able to really contribute. And it would take me time to get that knowledge. But at the same time, they told me, well, you have a 3-year contract on your PhD. It's a PhD, it's supposed to be 3 years. I was at the end of my third year. I had 1.5 papers or something. And then, okay, I got a research assistant contract at the university, so I could prolong that. And then I got a job. So I went back to Luxembourg and I just started working. And I worked on my PhD on the side. And so it was not easy, but I guess, as you said, like this Tolstoy joke, I think it's never easy. I don't think I ever spoke to anyone that did a PhD that told me, oh yeah, it was just, it was trivially simple. I never had that conversation. So I guess it's not so unique, but in my case, it was really, I just wasn't ready. I just wasn't ready to do, I didn't know what it meant to do research basically. And again, that wouldn't be a problem if you had more than 3 years, which I think 3 years is anyway ridiculous, even if you learn how to do research during your master's degree by chance or whatever, or if you're really good, fine. But even then, 3 years is extremely short to contribute, especially nowadays. It wasn't the same, I guess, 20, 30, 40 years ago, but nowadays there's so much output out there. There's so much research. If you want to do a literature review on any topic, it takes you so much time. You have to read and read and read and read and read and read, and then write and write and write and code and code and code. It's really, really tough. So I really admire people that have these huge outputs that are able to write 2, 3, 4 papers by year. It's crazy. I don't know how they do it. And once I realized that this was not good for my mental health, I just said, you know what, I'm going to finish it, but I don't care about how long it's going to take me. And so it took me 6 years in the end, finish the PhD. But now I have it. I'm happy, and I'm happy in my job. So it turned out well in the end.
Yeah, thanks very much for sharing that story too. That's very interesting. Finishing a PhD when you're working is a unique form of challenge that I've had sort of friends go through, and I know how hard that can be. It's interesting too that the detail you mentioned about the system changed when you were in the middle of it, and that's actually kind of a curiously, because the process is so long from starting an undergrad to finishing a PhD. That's actually kind of a relatively normal thing, and it's different with different universities and stuff like that. So there's no matter how resourceful you are, fortune plays a role in any long-term enterprise. And that's actually one of the interesting things about sort of actually completing a PhD is it means that you've probably overcome numerous challenges that had nothing whatsoever to do with the subject that you were studying.
Right.
I do have to say I have one friend for whom it was all just on rails, and he go by that national stereotype, he happened to be German. Just
yeah, that's great. I mean, when it works out like that, it's great, really.
Yeah. It's interesting too when you mentioned making a contribution for anyone who's listening. To get a PhD, typically this sort of normal line is, your thesis or your papers or whatever have to make a real contribution to your field.
Right.
The question that begs is, well, how do I know what's in the field? And like, you have to read everything,
Exactly.
basically, and or talk to enough people to get a sense of everything. And that's actually one of the biggest challenges. And when you think about why does it take so long, well, it's not just a matter of like writing something. You kind of have to read everything in your narrow field.
Exactly.
And that's one of the things that makes it such a big challenge. And also, I would share too that a similar version of that experience that I've had, that you had, like, when you decided, I'm not going to be a researcher, I'm not going to go into academia, so my PhD kind of means something different now.
Mm-hmm.
A version of that I've heard, like, not joking, was no one's ever going to read it.
That's also true.
But once you realize that, like, you can be thinking there, who is that character Casaubon from like Middlemarch or whatever, you can get sort of bogged down in like, it's gonna be the greatest work of genius ever written, and it's like, it might be, but no one's gonna read it.
Right, absolutely.
Once you realize that, it's just a way of sort of like, because after all these years of doing all this work and getting really specialized in something, you can sort of lose perspective on like the very
right.
practical matter of like finish,
right.
Which is, again, easy to say when you're on the other side of it, but when you're in the middle of it, like, that just finish can be one of the hardest things, which is also true of writing books.
Exactly.
As it happens, which anyone listening to this who's actually finished that long-term process where all kinds of other things were going to, it's true in everything, right? I remember talking to an acquaintance of mine when after he got his first book of poetry published, he's like, I had to go through so much to get my first book published, and almost none of it had anything to do with poetry.
Oh, wow, yeah. It's all the things around it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's true of so many different things. But anyway, so we're here today to talk, now that we've talked about you for the first part of the interview, we'll move on to the second part where we talk about your latest book, which is Building Reproducible and Analytical Pipelines with R. Or RAPs, which is a term that we may end up using, reproducible analytical pipelines. And so, yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about who the book is for.
Oh, that's a good question. I tried to not make an easy book. So I didn't want the book to be too introductory. So that's also why there's like a chapter, one of the first chapters in the book is, before we start, here's are the things you should know. And if you don't know them, it's fine. Go read something else and then come back. But you have to know these things. And so the book, I would say, is for some people that are already familiar with some of the concepts that I talk about and that are already comfortable as well with the programming language R. But, and this is also how I felt for a very long time, and sometimes even today, they're comfortable with it, but they feel that there's something missing. Like when I look at some of the packages from other programmers, some other authors, they do amazing things. Sometimes it looks like magic to me. I don't understand how they do it. And I felt like, okay, I want to write something for the people that are kind of in the middle, right? They know stuff, but somehow the little push is missing to know more stuff. Sometimes it's, sometimes again, you have to meet a mentor, or you have to, read a book that somehow illuminates you. And I tried to write a book in that way. I hope I succeeded. And that's why the book is not like an introduction, and it's not for beginners, but it's a book that requires people to already know some stuff. And so it's a book that I think should be useful to researchers, but not only, also to people working in the private sector that need to write their code in a way that it can be reproducible. Not necessarily for reproducibility's sake, especially in the private sector, but just because if you set up your pipelines in such a way, then almost automatically you get pipelines that are also well tested and well documented. So it's also because I wanted people to write high quality code and well-documented code. So that's why I focused so much on the reproducibility part. Even if you're not going to rerun exactly the same stuff in 6 months or in 6 years, doesn't matter. It's just that by having this kind of frame, or even you could say even restrictions. By having these restrictions that we put on ourselves to work in this certain way, we ensure a certain quality and a certain documentation, etc., that goes along with our code. And so the book, is for, I would say, intermediary people. Doesn't matter what you do. Of course, if you're a scientist, I think reproducibility there is quite important. But even in the private sector, that's also why I always talk, like in the book I mentioned, okay, if you cannot use GitHub, for example, because you work, you're in your company, and maybe try to, here's how you can work without, having GitHub, but you can still have Git, for example, just on your machine, or you can set up like an internal Git forge, etc., etc. So the book is for, I would say, this kind of intermediary level users that there's not a lot of content for. I feel there's a lot for beginners. There's also a lot for experts. That's research, basically. You have to go through research papers, or these very thick manuals that are super complicated. But these people that are in the middle, there's not a lot for them, and that's also how I write my blog posts. My blog that I started also, like when I started my PhD, so 11 years ago now, I try to write blog posts that are not for beginners, because there's already so much there, and it's for me at least, it's a bit boring to write for beginners. Like, no offense to beginners, we're all beginners in something, but it's just like, it's not that what gives me, let's say, energy. But writing for that people in the middle is where I really feel at home, and that's why I try to do in the book. I hope I succeeded.
Yeah, no, it's one thing I really like about the book and the way you frame it is by saying, you talk about the sort of story, if I'm not mixing up blog posts with your book in my head, but you talk about, you sort of had this challenge, I'm going to be teaching a university course, what can I teach? And
Right.
And one thing you realized was, like, actually there's, like, although you're not sort of primarily a coder, this is like a really interesting topic to me anyway, but like, because I'm not a coder either, but like, programmers figured a lot of procedural stuff out that's actually really useful and can be applicable in other areas. And that's kind of one of the ways you use to sort of frame what you're doing here is like,
Exactly.
and so for example, one of the ways, I describe, what's this whole computer code thing? And it's like, well, it's writing, first of all. And secondly, imagine if you wrote a book and there was one typo, and that meant no one could open it. Right. Like, and read a single word, like, like, welcome. So now imagine that was your challenge as a book publisher, that like one typo meant your book couldn't open. Let's say you had a print run and you distributed them to all the stores. You had all the, sort of advanced reviews out, and then no one could open the book. Well, you'd figure out pretty quick some techniques for not having typos, not letting typos get through. And you'd probably have a much more technically sophisticated way of reviewing and accepting potential changes to what you've done and things like that. And so when you talk about using Git and GitHub and stuff like that, so Git, for anyone listening, is a version control system, which is a lot better than track changes in Microsoft Word.
Oh yeah.
And so it can be, it's sort of funny the way we divide things up in our minds, like, well, that's programming, so that doesn't have anything to do with this other thing. And it's like, there's whatever metaphor you want to use about higher level or lower level. No, there's techniques for writing and for managing projects that programmers have figured out. If you think about, like an airplane nowadays has millions of lines of code, and it's going to crash if you fuck up, right?
Yeah.
Like, so like there's actually lots of really important techniques that even if you're not a programmer, that you can learn about managing your work and what you're doing. And so in order to talk about this, I think it's actually sort of the sort of most natural way in is to talk about these three words on their own: reproducible, analytical, pipelines. So when you say pipeline, you're not talking about the thing with oil or gas in it. So I was wondering if you could talk for a moment for anyone listening. What do you mean by pipeline?
Right. Well, actually, of course, it's not the pipeline that delivers gas or oil, but it's the pipeline that delivers data. So the idea, a pipeline is in the book, in the story, and not just like, it's not, I didn't invent the concept. Actually, the reproducible and analytical pipelines idea that comes actually from the UK, from the ONS, from the official, Office for National Statistics.
Yeah.
They are the ones that kind of introduced this this name. And so the pipeline here is the idea or is the process by which you start from raw data, and then you write a bunch of code, and at the end of that pipeline you get some product. I call them products. It could be a Word document with tables and figures. It could be another data set that is clean. It could be a trained machine learning algorithm, whatever, it doesn't matter. Something that uses data as an input. And I call them data products. And so this pipeline is a bunch of code put together. And you start from this raw data that is not clean, that has maybe some problems that you have to solve. And then at the end, this data flows through the pipeline and you get your data product at the end. And it's literally just code, basically.
Okay, great. So the pipeline here is you start with some data and you end up with something. It might be a chart. It might be a Microsoft Word document. It might be a bunch of tables and stuff like that. And so then the analytical part is what you do with the data that you start with to get it to the end of the pipeline.
Right. So the analytical part, that would be the analysis itself. Let's say what is it that you put in the pipeline to kind of make it work to reach the goal that you have. So for example, if I start from raw data and I want clean data, then I have maybe to do some filtering in my pipeline. I have to do some selections. Maybe I need to do some data imputation, things like that. I end up with my data. Or if I want to train my machine learning algorithm, well, in my pipeline, in the part of the analysis will be to figure out my model, figure out my features, my algorithms, etc., etc. So that's why it's an analytical pipeline, because I'm doing an analysis. This analysis can be very simple, can be just a chart, that's it. But maybe it's a very important chart, and maybe I need to make extra sure that I know what I'm doing, because this chart will then be used by the prime minister for some press conference or whatever. And so that's why it also needs to be reproducible, because if there is something weird, and this happened to me numerous times, there's something weird in the figures I produced, well, I need to be able to go back and rerun the whole thing and make sure I understand. Actually, today and yesterday, we had this discussion with some colleagues where we need to answer. So I work at the ministry, and we get questions from Parliament, probably in any country. And so we are producing our statistics, etc., to answer the question. I did it in R with my pipelines, and a colleague, as a 4-eyes check, did it in Excel, because he's not like a statistician, but he knows how to handle data, etc. And so he did it in Excel, and we mostly found the same results just for one table. And I asked him, hey, what did you do for this table? Because I cannot find the same results. So maybe you have like another hypothesis, or you did something else, whatever. And he told me, well, I don't know, because Excel crashed, and I'm not able to recover the Excel workbook. So I don't remember what I did, because I did so much things, I clicked so much things, so I don't remember. So we don't know. So we're going to go with my results that hopefully is correct, I hope. And his result was not too far off anyway, so it should be fine. But just to illustrate that, just like literally today, we talked about that. He doesn't know, and he did that yesterday. He did it literally yesterday, and he doesn't remember what he did. And I'm not blaming him. Like, it's not his fault. And he's a very competent colleague. It's just that the tool does not allow you to retain that information. And so if you lose it, you lose it. That's it.
It's that actually, like, that's you did my segue for me that I was going to do. It's interesting. You mentioned on your Leanpub profile that you're into ancient philosophy, and like I suspect you've read some existentialism as well, because there's a bit your description of like just say dealing with Excel. So when I was doing my investment banking job, there was lots of kind of high level financial modeling, which was all Excel, and the way you describe it, like it's actually just a bunch of clicking. And you might have been awake for 30 hours, and then you sort of like give your output, and then you wake up the next day and you're like, I don't remember. And there's
exactly.
there's no record of it was just sort of quite striking to me the way you captured it. Like there's no record of all the clicking that you did.
Exactly.
And that's really interesting. And this is a sort of everyday challenge that, and like I think we're now getting to the heart of like one of the reasons you wrote the book is that when you say mid-level, what you mean is people might be real experts in something, but at these processes for thinking about the thing, what are you act like? So for example, in my job, it was like, go model a natural gas, pipeline development project. And it's like, okay, I'll do something, and we'll get there in the end. But like, where'd you start? Where were you at the middle? Can you do it again? I'll just give a copy. Give a copy of the file to a junior. But like, so just to get like, and it's sort of, we could talk about it forever, but the details of things. So for example, to avoid the situation that Bruno's colleague had, every time you open an Excel file that you're working on, save as a new version and add 1 to the end of it. I mean this very seriously to anyone who works in Excel. At the end of your file name, it should be called like, financial model 1.00. Every time you open it again, save as a new version, and now it's 1.01. Next time 1.02. And one of the reasons this is so important is that if it crashes, you will have a latest version that worked, but B, you can actually go back and check.
Exactly.
And you can easily share them with people and things like that. So you can go and like you're gonna have oh shit moments. And at the very least, okay, at least I can go back. I know that I'm going to have something back there in the trail before my mistake that I can come up with and things like that. And like, it's just, but anyway, then so Bruno's Bruno's book is like that, but like way better.
But what you're describing is actually some simple version control system. The issue is that you have to do it. You have to think about it. You have to do it, and you have to remember to do it. And that's also what I wanted to explain in the book. We have to remove this cognitive load. Your brain has to focus on the analysis because that's already a lot of work. All these things like saving these versions, etc., which is great and you should do it. But the problem is there. You have to remember, if you version control it, well, you have to remember to push, right, and to commit. But it's the barrier to entry and the cognitive load is so much lower. It's so much lower. And it works so much better also to handle conflicts. If you work at several people on the same file, Git handles conflicts much better than any other version control system or track changer system that you could think of. And that's also one of the points of the book is I want you to be able to focus just on the analysis, and all the rest, let the computer handle it for you.
It's that's super interesting. That reminds me of a very specific thing as well. That the way having protocols actually relieves cognitive load. And so one of the best protocols that we have for relieving cognitive load in our working lives is email. The email protocol. So a lot of people think email, oh well, something Gmail or it's my Outlook or whatever. Here's what email is there's a structure to it. There's an address that something came from. There's an address that something went to. There's maybe a copied, a CC'd address that something was copied. So, but that's an important distinction. It's not the person who it actually went to. It's just someone of adjacent interest. There might even be the blind copy, which tells you something about the relationship between that address and what else is going on. There's a copy on your end, and there's a copy on the receiving end. There's a timestamp. There's a subject line. There's content, body contents, and then there's attachments. And I remember talking to someone who, because when you're working in like a big global kind of company on all kinds of complex projects, version control becomes really important. And I actually at one point got to talk to a guy who turned out like a friend of mine's brother-in-law actually was like a salesman at one of these sort of companies that sold these big, version control systems. And I remember him getting like really like passionate, like we can get about these things. And he's like, why do people keep using email? He's like, I like people will actually, they'll do the thing on the system, but then they'll send an email just to have their own copy. And it's like, well, because actually one thing I didn't mention was that if you've got Outlook in particular, you can have folders in your email. And it's like, it's that whole cognitive load thing. It's like, there's so many ways to access that memory or to find that email that you sent because of that protocol, right? All you have to do, what day was it? What month was it? What folder did I put it into? Who did I send it to? You know what I mean? Like what you can see the little attachment thing on the icon on the side. Like just this simple protocol actually is like hugely valuable for organizing information, finding it again, and finding things again is a really important thing about reproducibility, which and now I want to talk about the most important word in, reproducible analytical pipelines is reproducibility. And that word resonates on a number of levels. One of which people who sort of read sort of the science news might be aware of is that there's been this sort of thing called a reproducibility crisis in science, which you talk about. And this actually goes back to the sort of whole PhD thing, which is like, there's all kinds of pressures to sort of succeed if you want to get a job as a professor outside your PhD, if you want to, get the promotion, if you want to get tenure, if you want to get things like that. So it's a different way of doing it, but there's pressures in the private sector to produce as well that mean like, just get all the clicking done, get your output, and who cares? But of course, there can be situations where you do care. So with respect to this concept of the RAP, what's the reproducibility that you're talking about there?
So I I introduce in the book, in the beginning of the second part of the book, I introduce the reproducibility iceberg. So I show how you can start at the top of the iceberg and then you can go deeper and deeper and deeper. And this is just to illustrate that reproducibility is on a continuum, let's say. So you can just focus on, so you write your script, right? And your script depends on a certain set of packages. So these packages will provide certain functions that you can use, okay? These packages may require a specific version of R, for, let's say R 4.2 or whatever. Now, my script, my analysis, or my analytical pipeline maybe is already running on a certain version of Windows as well, and etc., etc., etc. So what I explain with this continuum is that, okay, you can just focus on making a script reproducible. So for example, don't use hard-coded paths, absolute paths that only exist on your computer, like my documents, Bruno, data.xl, right? That only exists on my computer. So if I share this file, it's already not reproducible because that person will have to adapt the path. And it's annoying. So it's not a lot, but it's annoying. So I can try to think of ways to not have to do that, such that the file, wherever the file is, it can run. So I can just focus on that. Then I can focus on, okay, but maybe that's not enough. Maybe I should also think about my packages, because my packages, they have certain versions attached to them, right? And these versions evolve, these packages evolve. So maybe in 6 months, the function that I was using maybe changed names or whatever, or in the next version of the package, maybe that function will be deprecated for another one. This happens. These are things that happen. It doesn't happen too much in the R ecosystem, I must say, but it happens. It happens. Then there's the R version itself. So there are, maybe my code will run and produce a certain result on this version of R that I have today, but who knows in 5 years. And I actually did, I think it was last year in November, December, I did an analysis where I took all the example codes. So R ships with some example codes that you can run. And I ran all the example codes from version 0.5, which was released, I think, in 2004-ish, 2006, something like that. Don't remember exactly now. And I ran them on the then current version of R. So it was R 4.2.1, something like that. And I just tallied the successes and the errors. And what you see is that, of course, through time, there's more and more successes. But even like a version from 2 years ago, there is some example code that doesn't run anymore. It's not a lot, but if your pipeline happens to use that specific function, then in the current version of R, it wouldn't run anymore, right? So even with just the code that ships with R, this can change. So you have to think about the packages that change. You have to think about the language itself that changes. And this is even more dramatic in Python, because there was the switch in Python, and this was during my PhD. And at the time, I was also using Python for a project with German colleagues. There was the switch between Python 2 and Python 3. And it was quite horrible at the time, because Python 3 was quite different in many ways from Python 2, and so it was horrible to manage both versions. So R does not have a lot of that, but still it has that, you know. So you have to think about packages. You have to think about the R version. Now comes the operating system. If you really want to go, you know, very deep, well, the problem is that the operating system ships with some very low-level functions, low-level code and libraries for linear algebra, basically. And these also change. And this is not something that you have almost any control of. So what can happen, and this is very rare, but it can happen, and depending on your application, it may be very important. The same code that runs on Windows will produce a different result than the exact same code that runs on Linux, for example, or on macOS. And sometimes it even produces a different result on different versions of Linux or different versions of macOS. Again, very rare, and usually with certain situations where you work with very large or very small numbers. So this is usually quite complicated for computers, but it can happen. So you also have to think about operating systems. So how are you going to deal with that? And this is why I introduced Docker, where I say, okay, if you Dockerize your pipeline, so this means that you are going to encapsulate your pipeline and you are going to ship it with the operating system, basically. Docker, in a way, it's kind of a virtual machine. Not exactly, but it's kind of like a virtual machine. If you ship your code with R, with your packages, and with the operating system, such that the user can then run your pipeline from Docker, then you are almost, I say almost guaranteed that the result is going to be the same. Why do I say almost? Because strictly speaking, your Docker image can also change. So if you build your image today, and if you build the image in 6 months, because so building an image is the process by which you create this Dockerized pipeline. So if you build it at different dates, it can also ship with different versions of very low-level code. So what you have to do there is you either also use kind of a versioned version of Ubuntu or Linux, but usually it's Ubuntu. So you either have to use that, or you have to use another tool that I don't talk about, which is called Nix. So this is kind of a package manager that really allows you to reproduce a development environment to the bit. So it allows you really to have bitwise reproducible analytical pipelines, basically. And this is a subject of another book, because it's way more complex. But if you really need that, if you really need your pipeline to be reproducible to the bit, then there are tools for that as well. And this is used in like high performance computing environments and things like that.
Yeah, so that's a really great explanation. And for anyone who might be feeling a little bit lost, I can sort of give you a concrete example that will make sense of a lot of this. So there was and it might sound arbitrary, but you'll know what I'm getting at it right away. So in the world of literary archiving, computers represent a problem. In the past, when an author died, you got the boxes of papers from their study, and then you had their papers, right? And what did you do? Well, you kept them in a dry environment, and you made sure that there was fireproof and stuff like that. But like you knew what to do. You had a filing system. You went to where the files were. You maybe tagged them with some kind of like these are related to this novel or this diary or from this year or what have you, and you could go to the document, which has a bunch of like characters written on it, and you could find it. Then computers happen, and all of a sudden the literary archivist gets a box and there's a bunch of papers in it, and then there's a floppy disk, and they're like, oh shit, what am I going to do with this, right? And so and one thing that happened was there was this, if I'm recalling the timeline correctly, around the mid-90s there was this, with a lot of libraries, they did a big digitization project where they put all these digital files on laser discs. Remember the big ones? But then that got outdated, and so this problem of and this is now not a problem because of the way apps work now. This isn't the problem like it was, but it used to be that like if a new version of Microsoft Word came out, the old Word file you had on your computer, like you might install the new version of Word, it might not have been able to open the old one. Or if it did, it might introduce errors. If you're old enough, you remember what this was like. So the one way you can imagine to solve this, which would be if you imagine you had a container, a sort of digital container where that Word file came with the version of Word that it was written with. Now, and then you'd ask, well, but like, how does that work? How does that work over time? Because like computer operating systems change. Well, imagine that container that we're talking about had the computer operating system in it. And you're like, well, then, but how do you run one computer operating system on another computer operating system? Well, that's when you have something called a virtual machine. But then, like, ultimately, there's some really fancy computer science going on when you get to the sort of what you're calling the bitwise level. But anyway, I hope that sort of like example that I'm bringing up of like just like sort of reading ordinary text documents written on computers. And so when Bruno was talking about Docker is this idea around these containers. And so the idea that I was describing, so the idea is that like you're be able to preserve a computing environment over time. And you might be doing fancy data science, you might be writing a novel, whatever. Preserving that process over time means preserving all the tools, the versions of the tools that you were using, and the version of the operating system that was running all the tools as well, is the real kind of ultimate challenge. But one thing that's super interesting about this is that might all sound like very like sort of fancy technology stuff. One of the hardest things about reproducibility is just doing it.
Yes.
Like, well, really, I have to save a new version and add one at the end again? Really, every time? No, I'm just not going to do it this time. As you write in the book, future you will want to murder present you if you don't. Basically, it's like doing surgery without washing your hands.
Yeah.
You just have to do it. You might be like a genius brain surgeon. You still have to spend 10 minutes washing your hands before you go into surgery. You just have to.
Yeah. I actually read a book on that, the Checklist Manifesto, I think it was, which they were talking about introducing checklists in operating rooms. And now this like saved so many lives. Nowadays, it seems so obvious that you have to wash your hands. You have to make sure the tools are there. You have to make sure that it's the right patient. You have to make sure that you are going to operate on the right leg. But before introducing checklists, so many accidents happened because people didn't do this stuff consistently.
Well, that's true. That's interesting. That reminds me, actually, I have a friend who's a brain and spine surgeon, and I actually asked him about this once, and he got very serious. And he brought up something that you bring up in your book as well. But there's a trade-off, right? Like every minute I'm checking a list, I'm not doing brain surgery. And that means that other patients are getting pushed out. That means I'm not getting more practice, which is very, very important for things like that. And so like that, and that's actually like sort of the answer to the kind of like exasperated question, why don't we do all these things all the time, is time. And there are demands, that the boss might be like, I need the output from you at 5. The prime minister's giving a speech at 5:15. Like, we're not going to delay the prime minister's speech because, you want to clean your data. Like, give me a result. But that's where the protocols come in. The better the protocols you have, the less cognitive load you need to devote to things like that, the more sort of like reproducible analytical pipelines that you have in your system, the more you'll be able to handle those high stress situations, the more you'll be able to, because like the other side of that is like, the number you gave was wrong. And you're like, well, you told me I had 5 minutes to do it, but so now we need to issue a correction. Well, but if you did things properly, even if you made a mistake, you can actually go back and find where the mistake came from.
Exactly.
And you can issue your correction.
That's exactly that. It's also why I am, and I also explained that in the book, I am really against, and I think it's really a problem that there's these no-code tools where there's no code. That's the point of these tools, where you can click, and Excel in a way is a no-code tool unless you use VBA, okay? But if you just click around, there's no code, and if there's no code, there's no trail. And so, whatever you did, is it wrong? Yeah. Where? I don't know. I just have to start from scratch. And that's also something I insist in the book, the time aspect. I write at some point, I remember a sentence, I wrote something like, I know we're in the real world and there's real world constraints. So I'm going to show you how to do the minimum amount of stuff that you really should do, which is use Git. This doesn't take a lot of time if you can. And use the renv package, because the renv package, what it does, once you're done with your analysis, However, the quality of your analysis, if you wrote a pipeline or not, if it's just a script or whatever, you just launch renv, and this gives you a file, and it's literally 5 seconds. It gives you a file with all the versions of the packages that were used for the analysis, plus the version of R. So if you provide that file to someone, that someone can then recreate the development environment that you worked on using Docker and this file. You can literally put that file in Docker and restore the complete R environment with this file. So I say at least just do that. Just use Git if possible and use renv and put that renv file on Git, so that if you don't have time to go further, if you don't have time to go to mess with Docker, etc., that's fine. But at least other people can take that file and reproduce your results. And maybe future you will be able to do it if needed. At least you have something.
I can guarantee future you, dear listeners, will benefit a great deal from reading this book, Building Reproducible Analytical Pipelines with R. I think we've gone into enough detail for this segment of the interview. And so for the last segment of the interview, we always like to talk about, if the guest is an author, about their writing process and things like that. And so I guess I'd like to begin with, so you got into blogging 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And you write a little bit about your approach to blogging, which I found sort of very sort of relatively unique, where you said, like, one of the reasons I've been kind of successful at it is because I don't care about how many people read it. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that approach to blogging.
So there's two things, let's say. The first of all, I did not want to have like trackers on my blog. I must say, for full transparency, I do have a tracker on the website of my book, so that I know if people are reading it, but not on my blog. And the reason is because I browse the web with and I block all trackers and all ads. So I'm sorry for other content creators, but I block all the ads. And people, if you watch, like I have a YouTube channel. If you watch my YouTube channels, don't hesitate to block ads. I don't get any money from it anyway, so just block them. So I block everything. So I did not put any trackers. I did not want to know if people read it or not. And I also don't care, because the reason I started blogging was because I just wanted to have, you mentioned emailing as a way of like keeping track and removing a cognitive load and keeping track of files. Blogging for me is like that. It's just part of my brain that I put on the internet where I file things. And I'm probably the person that reads my blog the most, because whenever I solve a problem at work or I write a blog post about it, here's how I did it. It might be useful to other people, maybe not. I don't care. But I know that I will come back to it sooner or later, and I know that I will be happy to have something written with all the details, all the code, all the text, all the story. And so that's why also I don't care, because it's primarily for me. Now, of course, I'm very happy when people read it, when people tweet at me that they read one of the blog posts and that they found it useful. I'm very happy with that. But I know I literally wrote some blog posts that no one ever read. I just know it because like the tweets didn't get any likes or any retweets or whatever. Never got anyone commenting on them. But I've used them and I keep reusing them. So I'm happy. I'm fine with that. And then also it's because I just enjoy the process of writing just by itself. I enjoy the process of having solved the problem and now thinking to me, okay, now let's sit down like for an hour or two and write something to explain the process, to explain it to me. And sometimes doing that, I realize I actually did a mistake or I actually overcomplicated things. Now that I'm sitting down and rewriting it like I'm trying to explain it to someone else, I realized, but wait, I could have done it that another way, which is way simpler. So I have drafts from blog posts that never made it because I realized that the overcomplex solution that I engineered was just that, overcomplex. And now it's so simple that it doesn't even require a blog post. So this happens as well. And so this whole process for me is enough by itself, let's say. So that's how I blog basically. It's like that.
Yeah, no, one thing I found sort of really interesting about your way of approaching writing, about your writing, because you wrote this blog post about, like, it's been 10 years now and sort of, here's my approach, things like that, there's a unique challenges to writing in the digital, in the digital age, right? Where, because if you want to, you can see reader engagement. And the problem that we're going into now, I mean, is worth many books and many podcasts, is you can sit there you can get really preoccupied with how much engagement you're getting.
Yeah.
I've had at least 2 guests who like got moderate success. And I only say that in comparison to the people with millions of followers, but like quite successful on Twitter.
Yeah.
And a couple of them it turned into a real problem because they'd like write a tweet and they'd be like looking at it.
Yeah.
Why did this one get 10,000 retweets and that one got none?
You're
Why
right.
did so-and-so's tweet get 20,000 retweets and mine on the same thing didn't get any?
Right.
And another thing you can start doing is basically writing to the algorithm, right? Because that can be a literal algorithm. It can be the kind of effective algorithm of human engagement. But if you start writing to feed this very particular beast, eventually you become the food.
Exactly.
And that might be good. I mean, I'd love to be more famous than I am, but at the same time, you do have to, when you, particularly with writing, you can do whatever you want. But one thing that, there's versions of success that can be kind of not what you set out to do, and something that, again, future you might look back on and regret that you sort of got too preoccupied with. Which is a really important challenge. And I mean, I hope everyone listening to this faces that challenge of getting too much attention at some point. Yeah, no, you write very well about that. And one thing also that I've spoken with people about is that, and they say the same thing you do, which is like, often the ones, well, I mean, I think you said this, but like, the things that people like the most are the things that are most useful to them. And what's most useful? How I did X. People love that. I mean, like I think we don't really use it much anymore, but we used to post pretty regularly on Leanpub on Medium, and like the most popular post we ever had was like a crazy little hack for getting an EPUB on your iPhone if it's the file's too big.
And I totally see why. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's. I also see that my blog posts that have how-to in the title, I don't write a lot of them, but those that are kind of how-tos, they get reshared a lot more. Yeah, definitely more. And you said something where it really resonated with me. That now I have a blank. SEO, basically feeding the algorithm. So I never wanted to do any type of search engine optimization, because, as you said, it would end up like a job. Like, I have to write this because that's the hot topic now, and I want my blog to be featured in the search results on top, and now I have to write about that. So, for example, I have no blog post about ChatGPT. Not that I don't find it interesting. I find the technology fascinating, but I have nothing to say about it. Like, there's much smarter people that know much better things about these LLMs than me, and so read them. But if I was like tracking, trends, now I would write, how to use LLMs or ChatGPT in R or whatever. But that's not me. Like, if I had used it in my job to solve a problem, I would write about it.
Yeah,
but I don't.
You'd have a lot more posts about Bitcoin.
Exactly. Right.
I guess the second last thing I'd like to talk to you about is, so for anyone listening, people who are familiar with Leanpub, so Leanpub is a self-publishing platform. We have lots of sort of really interesting writing modes where you can write in Leanpub, but we also have an upload writing mode where you can, which we built because people are like, hey, I've got my own way of writing books. Why can't I use all the interesting in-progress publishing, blah, blah, get 80% royalties features on Leanpub, why do I have to use one of your writing modes? Mm-hmm. So we have this upload writing mode, which means now we've got N writing modes, because as long as you can provide us with an ebook file, you can publish your book on Leanpub. And you used something called Quarto
right,
to make your book. And so I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about Quarto and like what sort of type of book that's best used for.
So Quarto is a relatively recent tool. I think maybe 2 years old max, and it was published kind of to the public last year. And before that, it was just like in pre-releases and stuff. And it's a tool developed by a company called Posit, and this company is quite well known for their RStudio programming interface for R. So maybe you heard of RStudio. Yeah. So the company behind it is Posit. They changed their names relatively recently as well. And so Quarto is a tool that allows you to. It's mostly aimed at like scientific or technical writing, but you could use it to write a very normal, a document without any math or any programming, because it's a flavor of Markdown. So you write in Markdown, but then you have, they call them chunks. So you can have an R chunk, a Python chunk, or from a chunk from many other programming languages. And what happens is that when you compile your document, so you have all your Markdown files or your QMD files, Quarto Markdown files, with all these chunks, right? And when you can decide to compile it to ebook, so EPUB like I did, and PDF. And what happens is that this gets, so your Quarto file that contains the R chunks gets compiled into a PDF, and the R chunk gets evaluated at compile time. So for example, if that chunk produces a graph, right? So you write the code, but in the output, you will see the graph. So this is really great for technical writing, because you don't have to copy and paste graphs, from whatever tool you're using, like R or whatever, to Word or even to LaTeX or to another Markdown kind of system. You can literally write the code that produces the graph, or the table, or the model, or whatever. And you can even have like inlined chunks. So for example, you can write a sentence. Last year, inflation was at, and then after the at, you put an inline R chunk that kind of gets, that loads the data from somewhere, or computes the inflation rate on the fly from somewhere. And then in the end result, you just see the figure. You don't see the code anymore. And you can do both. You can show the code and the output, or just the output, depending on the target audience. And so Quarto is really useful, because from a single source, for example, the source of the book, from this single source, I get the EPUB, I get the PDF, and I get a website. So the website that you can read the book on is also generated using Quarto. So it's quite nice. It works with R, it works with Python, it works with Julia, it works with many other languages. And I think it was really nice to use it to write the book. And because it's Markdown, it's a very simple syntax, basically.
With the explanation already given that you didn't use our writing mode to write your book, the last question I always like to ask people on the podcast, if they've used Leanpub to publish a book, is if when you were using Leanpub, there was one thing that had you shaking your fist, damn you Leanpub, the whole time, or if there was some magical if there was a magical feature we could build for you, can you think of anything you would ask us to fix or build?
Well, I really would have loved, and you I think you provide this feature if you use your Markdown, so Markwa, right?
Yeah.
If you use your writing mode, which is to push on GitHub and have the EPUB published automatically, like on Leanpub. But if I could use that with Quarto, so I push and I get my EPUB that is generated, and that gets immediately like uploaded on Leanpub, that would be great. Like that would be really a feature that I would use, definitely.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't think we've ever had anyone ask for that before. So
but I thought that's how it worked. No, maybe I'm mistaken.
No, we haven't. We have an API that does that, but you have to be using one of Leanpub's writing modes. And so the thing we haven't been asked for before is if I'm providing my own EPUB file.
Yeah, right. Okay,
that's the thing. And so that's really interesting. I'll make a story about that and put it in our discussion queue.
Okay, great.
Because obviously, Leanpub's everyone's welcome, but a lot of our authors, whether they're writing about programming or not, are programmers, and having like APIs that sort of make things like easier for them to do is particularly important. Not even so much because it saves them time, but because they just know that there's this better way of doing it. And if it's not available to them, that's just sort of like part of the sort of like, sort of programmer psyche. It's just like, they just be frustrated. Bruno, thank you very much for taking the time out of your evening to be on the Leanpub Front Matter podcast. And thank you very much for using Leanpub as a platform for publishing your book.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed using Leanpub because there's kind of no barrier to entry. I can just write, I don't have to write a book proposal or whatever. I just can go. So that's why I chose Leanpub. And also it's a very, very nice and fair deal. So with the royalties. So that's why.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for having me. And see you maybe for another podcast once I'm done with my future book that is in my mind.
Definitely.
Bye. Have a nice evening.
Thanks.